Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. So if you're looking for parts to overhaul your own engine, you know where to go, ScooterWest.com. So today I'm doing part 2 of the Primavera or Sprint 3-valve motor. So this also applies for many other scooters from Piaggio that have specifically the air-cooled motor with the 3 valves in it. For example, it's like a 2013 Fly 150, any of the 946 scooters, or the Liberty sold here in North America from 2017 and on, all feature the same 3-valve engine and architecture. So this engine's kind of like a progression from the 2-valve engine that was used on the Vespa LX and ET4. Has a lot of similarities and improvements that are kind of found on the larger sibling like the GTS 300, 250. They don't have the dry Bendix style starter. They got a one-way clutch that's built in there. You'll see a little bit later. So this is the flywheel side or the right side of the motor. And you have the other side, the left side, which has your variator and belt drive. Had a lot of videos of how to service the transmission in the past. So this is all pretty familiar stuff. I'm not going to do much talking. I'm just going to zip through it. One more thing before I pulled the motor back out of the scooter, I did loosen the center stand because when you split the engine cases, you need the center stand out of the way. And they have a pretty strong pair of springs, and you got to get something like a spring puller tool and pull these springs off of the center stand. So they're off right now. Kind of don't have that on camera. All right, so the belt cover, a couple of fasteners are already loose from a ground strap and also the brake cable. So you want to pry this little cover off. The later models is just a small rectangular cover, very similar. And you're going to need a 19mm socket. I'm going to speed this up by using an electric or air impact. Technically, you don't really need the tool if you're using an impact, but there is the tool that locks up the crankshaft. You can put that in there if you want. Then you find a nut. There's a washer under there as well. And at this point, we'll go ahead and zip all the belt cover fasteners off. 8mm. You got a little clip. One's already loose. The hose is disconnected from the gearbox. Normally that hose is connected to a little rubber vent on the gearbox thing. We'll deal with that when we reassemble this motor. So kind of keep all these fasteners together. They're all going to be the same size screws. And at this point, you should be able to just pull the belt cover off. You may need to tap it a little bit. There's a little washer. Check that little bearing. Be perfect time to service the bearing, clean the belt cover. And of course, all these parts are going to get cleaned before we do the assembly. And oftentimes I'll carefully set down the belt cover. I'll use this as somewhere where I could store the parts. So you got the clutch bell that just pulls right off. You have the variator itself right up here. And this is the fixed half. You got the movable half on the inside that has the variator weights. There's two types of tools. You can either use the Bizzetti tool to lock up the variator. Probably could just impact that right off. If you're wondering what the factory tool looks like, it's a little more substantial, but not necessary. And it lines up to several of the fasteners that lock up that fixed half. And of course, during assembly, you want to use that. You don't want to just trust an impact. So with the crank locked up, you'll be able to get that free with the electric impact really easy, or a breaker bar. Get that tool out of the way. This isn't going to be a tool a do-it-yourselfer is going to have. Like I said, this is the Bizzetti version. All right, so you got a dome spring washer, a flat washer, and the pulley comes off. You have a thin washer that's a little smaller on the inside, so keep track of that order when you're putting it all back together. The variator is okay. The fixed half, not really any grooves in it, so that's good. Squeeze the belt and you can pull the whole clutch assembly off. And I've covered how to overhaul these driven pulleys and repack the grease. Grease looks pretty original, so I'll probably put some fresh grease and obviously clean this part. We'll set it aside for now. And now we'll get the variator out of the way. The easiest way is just pull the boss out and then kind of tip it. And if you can get your finger back there, kind of pull the ramp plate as well. If not, that's okay too. Just be prepared for rollers to want to fall out. So a lot of times you just tip it and the rollers sometimes will stay in place. They look pretty fresh actually. And then we'll go ahead and pull the ramp plate out. And this thing was a little over tightened, so that's probably why this is a little bit of a struggle. Kind of mushroom that just ever so slightly. And we'll put those little guide spacers in, may replace all those parts. Check them out a little further before I put it back together. But we'll come back to this later. So this is essentially the majority of the transmission for the Primavera, or Sprint, or any of the 3-valve motors. So there's also a gear case. We're probably not going to take apart the gear case. No real issues with it. Sometimes you want to replace the seal right here. There is some things that we'll access in later steps, is remove the timing cover and the oil pan. I've pretty much drained most of the engine oil. We're going to go ahead and spin the motor around and work on the flywheel side. All right, so we're going to start by removing the fan. In the service book, they do show the fan unbolts from, or this outer ring, and that's not the case. They change it to an all one piece molded one. There's 2 pegs that you can line up. Not really an easy tool to find. Sometimes you can find a pin spanner to hold the flywheel, so something like this, or fabricate something. But I'm just going to give it a try with an impact. And so pretty much just zip that off with a 12mm socket. And the way this is keyed on there is there's a little pin, there's a washer that comes off. There's a little pin into the crankshaft right there. And go ahead and just separate all those parts and put them away for now. This is where things are going to start getting oily. So put a pig mat under here, because even when you drain the engine, you're never going to get all the engine oil out. You have this connection right here, that's for your oil pressure sensor. If you do want to remove the sensor, it's a 21mm socket. And we use a little bit smaller impact. Several fasteners, 6mm fasteners, and you'll just use an 8mm driver. We'll start with the top pair. And that holds this bracket that the stator wires go through. So go ahead and set that aside. And at this point, kind of just move around. I'm going to clean all those parts when I get them apart. There's going to be some longer screws and a medium-sized screw, another medium-sized screw, shorter screw, long screw, kind of a medium screw. So, and we have 2 more. Another long screw here. So essentially you got 4 different sizes of screws. It's pretty easy to find out what so before we assemble it, I'll show you a trick to find out which ones. You could make a cardboard template to kind of house it, you know, all the different various size screws. Also have one down here. Kind of, that's always a trick when you have a lot of dirt on there. The short one, and I think that's pretty much it. And this gasket usually is not too stuck. You're gonna have some resistance because at this point we have the flywheel that's behind there, and there's some dowel pegs that hold this the alignment of this cover to the crankcase. And just pull it straight off. Make sure none of the wires become entangled. And at this point, you can see there's a stator plate. Probably a good idea to remove the dipstick as well. The gasket came off real clean. I'll clean all these parts when we get it all when I get it 100% apart. And probably the part solvent isn't really going to damage anything. Perfect opportunity to replace that seal. I do see them leak sometimes. Pretty easy to change out that seal now that we have it apart. So here's the flywheel. It's a little smaller than a GTS flywheel. So just to show you what the factory tool is, could order this. Is a rather expensive tool, and any do-it-yourself mechanic's probably not going to have it. There's 2 pins in here, and this tool will line up with those pins and has this large shaft that goes right in here. But there's other means to do that. You can put a strap wrench around the flywheel. You don't want to ever really clamp on the flywheel. When removing everything, you could just use an impact. There's enough resistance of all the items on there. Put a big deep, it's a 24mm deep socket, so go ahead and remove that. A little bit Loctite on there. And then there's also a washer. It's got a little dome to it, so keep that in mind. At this point, you're probably not going to just pull the flywheel off. Before we even set up a flywheel puller, I do want to remove this single screw here that holds the gear. So single screw, and I have a nice big number 3 Phillips driver here. And you're probably going to need a flywheel puller that's specific for these 3-valve engines. So here's the original Piaggio Vespa flywheel puller for the 3-valve motor. It's a pretty specific and important part if you are going to split the motor or take it all the way down or rebuild the starter clutch. Fortunately, Bizzetti has a less expensive alternative. Toolfly-3V is the Scooter West part number. And there's a few more parts included with this. So the spacer is pretty important. It slides on the end of the crank because the crank is so thin on the end. You have to have a spacer like that. So go ahead and unthread the bolt that's in the end of the flywheel puller itself. Take a little dab of grease, put it on the end. Go ahead and thread this all the way out. And never a bad idea to just put a little bit of grease or oil on the threads. And we'll go ahead and thread this, the puller onto that inner hub of this flywheel. So go ahead and thread it all the way on until it stops. Don't need to tighten it. And so that's stopped. Now we can thread this until it stops. I don't really recommend using air tools on these. So there, now it's stopped. I'm gonna get a pair of wrenches so it'll hold the puller itself. Then go ahead and tighten this, and you should hear a pop. There we go. I hit my nose a little bit. Comes off with a little bit of force. When you break the taper of the flywheel onto the crankshaft and separate that part. And while you're removing this little gear and that inner gear, just go ahead and pull both the gears and pull the flywheel right off the crankshaft. So this is your one-way clutch. If the starter is like slipping, you know, when you're trying to crank it and it's not engaging with the engine, this would be a perfect opportunity to take this apart. Typically, I don't really recommend taking these apart because there's some little rollers and springs that will pull apart. So if you're just overhauling the motor for a new bottom end, you can clean this part as a whole assembly and just leave it together. And typically when you replace both this gear and the starter sprag, as they call it, it's a one-way clutch, you replace them as a pair. This gear is usually just fine. So while you're on this side, a couple other things you remove. Go ahead and remove the starter motor itself kind of straddles both sides of the case. So if you have the two screws out, you can just carefully tap it out with a soft base mallet. So a good way to stay organized is the bag specific sets of hardware. So put the flywheel nut, washer, that little piece of steel that holds the ring gear up against the case there. And we can get this fender out of the way as well, T30 Torex. Maybe the last thing I'll do on this side is we'll go ahead and pull that gasket. Obviously a lot of stuff needs quite a bit of cleaning. Set that mud flap out of the way. The gasket, usually these treated gaskets, if you're real careful, you can pull them off. You may want to get a little razor blade in between. This one's coming off real cleanly. Here in the workshop, I do have a carbide scraper to scrape the remains of the gasket surface off the aluminum if needed. There's an oil passage right there. You got to be careful. You don't really want to gouge these cases because you might end up with a leak even with a new gasket. So this one's a little tight right there. A couple little bits of gasket remnant that will scrape off when I have this whole engine in the parts washer with that little piece there. So at this point, we'll go ahead and remove the center stand. Already got the bolt loose. Set that out of the way. There's one part that's going to be still with the case that you're going to need to remove, and it's a spacer. You may need a punch. So as you can see, it's very dry. Takes a little bit of effort to remove that. Normally, if you service the scooter, I'd recommend taking that out occasionally and greasing. Putting grease on this will make your center stand operate much nicer. We'll replace those O-rings. But we'll set that with the center stand. So at this point, the wheel's a little bit cumbersome. Now that we want to take the motor further apart and clean all these parts, don't really want the wheel in here. It makes for a really nice engine stand when you have both the center stand and the wheel in place, especially when installing and removing the motor out of these Primaveras, or pretty much any of the modern Vespas. It's kind of my preferred method of removing these. So we'll get the cotter pin out, just go and throw that out. Usually I use diagonal pliers. And just get our impact, go ahead and zip that off, 24mm socket. So I think somebody over tightened that. I'm going to go ahead and get the air impact. On the later models, they don't even have that castle that goes over the top of the nut or the cotter pin. They have a one-time use nut that's intended to be replaced every time you remove it. At this point, you should be able to remove the wheel. If it's a little stuck, the shaft doesn't have threads. A couple little taps sometimes will free it up. All right, if it's still not gonna remove, you may wanna hit it with a mallet from the backside. There we go. Just got a little bit of rust buildup on the splines here. Haven't been off for a while. The tire's right at the wear limit anyway, so probably before I put it together, I'll start with a fresh new tire. And if you're not familiar with these scooters, the early models for 2017 and prior, they used an 11-inch rear wheel on the Primavera. And 2018 and later, they just went to 12-inch across the board on all the Primaveras and the Sprints. And you can see there's quite a bit of rust in there. Just brake dust, clean that all out. Keep in mind there's a nice thick spacer. I've seen people lose a spacer and put together without it. And we'll go ahead and flip the motor back around. And we can tip it over. A couple things we'll take apart. Still have the 8mm socket. There's these clamps that hold the brake hose. They're usually pretty damaged just from going down a curb. And if I recall, all these screws are going to be identical in size. And don't be alarmed that it kind of pulls right away on its own because there's a spring underneath. I do see some telltales of a blown crank. You see that forbidden glitter right there? That builds up in the bottom of the oil pan. Go ahead and use that. We'll clean all these parts. These little dowels do come out. So just to prevent losing them, you can go ahead and remove all these dowels here. Go ahead and remove the gasket. Discard. And under here, I'm kind of tipping that spring. This is your pressure relief for the engine oil. So we'll go ahead and set that aside with the spring. And while we're in here, there's a little plate that's a baffle for the oil pump chain. So there's two smaller screws that hold this in place. And that's pretty important. It kind of keeps excess oil out of the chain so you don't drag down the motor by having excess oil getting slung around. So there's one way to lock up this, this oil pump is you can put a needle nose in there and put a 10mm socket to break it free. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and remove the timing cover. You could use one of the impact screwdrivers that you strike with a hammer, or if you have a really good number 2 bit in an electric impact, put some pressure and just break them all free. Just keep pressure on them because if you don't, you'll end up stripping. Screws, there's going to be copper washers. We'll go ahead and replace those when we reinstall the timing cover. But go ahead and save all the screws. And at this point, it's going to kind of get messy as we split the cases. So got a couple screws right there. So the way you get this little cover off is it's got some pull tabs. And sometimes it's not exactly the easiest thing to pull off. You may need to get 2 vice grips on there. Another option is you can get a slide hammer with the vice grip on it. Go ahead and tighten the vice grips on here. Not so tight because you can break those aluminum tabs off there. And at this point, I'm trying to evenly pull the timing cover off. There's an O-ring in there. All right, so I got 2 vice grips on there, and you stick the screwdrivers in there. I was simultaneously prying, and it's able to pop it off. There's gonna be a little rubber bit that guides the oil pump chain. There's an O-ring and a seal. Typically, you'd replace all these pieces. This sometimes could be reused, but it may be kind of hardened. Separate this out and put the screws with it. And of course, we'll clean this part. So you're wondering what's underneath this timing cover right here. You have that oil pump chain. Here's one issue with the oil pump. The sprocket actually will just spin on. It's not keyed to the crankshaft like the cam chain. So oftentimes you could just use a needle nose to kind of lock up that oil pump, get an impact on there. And there's a dome washer that locks that screw in place. I have a 10mm socket that I used. And at this point, you can pull the cam chain up. I find that these oil pump drive chains, unless something really catastrophically failed in there, they kind of last the life of the engine. Go ahead and derail the little sprocket. And we're able to pull this chain out from the top. So that's your oil pump. Again, probably set up a bag for all these pieces. Now the sprocket should pry off the crankshaft. There's an O-ring that's in a groove. So there's your oil pump dry sprocket. If this has any a good wear in it, you may want to replace that little sprocket. That's what seals up against the oil seal. You have a very thin washer. And oftentimes before you remove this thin washer, you may want to remove that O-ring that's on the crankshaft. And obviously when we reassemble it, we'll kind of do the reverse order. Start with the new O-ring. It's a very small little O-ring. That's what seals that sprocket. Now this little spacer will pull off with ease. And at this point, you have your cam chain. And the little sprocket in here, it's gonna have a little peg that lines up with that little slot right there. And make sure you don't jam up these the chain. Again, these, I kind of inspected the cam chain tensioner before I disassembled the top end, or when I disassembled top end, I think that chain still has a lot of life. So go ahead and set all those parts aside. Good idea also just to remove the oil pump and inspect it, or even just replace it if the motor ingests quite a bit of metal from a failed crankshaft like this one did. So the oil pump, two 5mm screws or hex head bolts that use an 8mm to remove. And you can use a large needle nose plier to kind of rock it back and forth to get the oil pump out of this little cavity here. It's going to be a gasket back there, and we'll deal with this later. Pretty inexpensive to replace it. They are pretty high volume oil pumps, and typically I've seen them hold up pretty good even when there's a lot of metal that may have been ingested. So just to give you a hint, I can see all that metal that's on that rag. So this engine case needs to be cleaned out quite thoroughly. And now we're at the point where we're going to go ahead and split the engine cases. So we're back on the right side of the case, so the flywheel side. So there's going to be several screws, again, various lengths here. Get them all out of here. And I'm kind of moving back and forth just to even the load here. With a one hidden back here. So actually all 8 of these fasteners are all the same length. And just double check, got everything separated. You could pull the oil strainer out, clean all these parts. Of course, replace that O-ring in here. Only a little bit of oil in there. We'll go ahead and clean or replace that oil strainer. At this point, we'll be able to split the case. So usually just a couple taps in a couple areas where there's no gasket mating surface. You may want to get the gasket out of here too for the you can also tear it, it's not getting reused. And my experience, almost every single one of these, they do have 3 different values of the gasket. They're almost always 0.6 of a millimeter. And just go ahead and rock that off and go ahead and pull the case half off. So you can see a lot of little metal fragments in here too, so this is going to have to be thoroughly cleaned. We'll scrape any remains of this gasket. Any of the gaskets that we remove, you don't want to have any of the remains of old gaskets left behind. So scrape all that, dispose of that gasket. But you can see all the metal in there. You got to make sure none of that's present. Remarkably, in all the years I've been doing these modern Vespa engines, 99% of the time, even when they're run out oil, the main bearing journals are still in really good shape. I see almost no scoring on this main journal. I wouldn't suspect there's any issues with it. Have no problem reusing it. You're gonna have the little plastic piece that the oil filter snaps into. You see, look at that O-ring. I don't know if that was a defect from the factory. The O-ring was like a little bit pinched. So obviously we'll replace that part. We're gonna clean these pieces here. But essentially this little plastic thing is what the oil strainer bites into. So it may have been captivating the oil pump, even though there was oil in there, after seeing the O-ring where it had a little defect like that. But regardless, I'm pretty certain the oil level is probably a little bit low, but that's, you know, that may have been a little defect. But there's a lot of metal everywhere in this, this case, and it's all from the big end bearing of your connecting rod that's failed. No, these cranks can't be really rebuilt. You just recycle this. This is the older style crank where it's kind of half a web. They have a number 1 right here, so we're going to replace it with a category 1 crankshaft. And there's also, sometimes you'll see a number 2. Sometimes it's actually engraved on the end here. We'll see how the new crank is, but it's got a 1 on both the webs. And that's the journal clearance right here. In the service book, they do have all the measurements for this. I have no reason to suspect there's any issues. There's only one minor little score right here. I'm sure it's still in good shape. It's just the big end bearing of the crankshaft that failed. And the same with this side bearing. Sometimes the thrust washer surface has a couple scores in there. That's not going to be really an issue. 3 other things of note inside the crankcase. There's another baffle plate that you can remove if you're doing deep cleaning of the inside of the case, but you could leave it in place. If you're wondering what this little thing is, that's an oil jet that takes the pressurized oil and sprays underneath the piston. Kind of prolongs the life of the piston and rings. And also this chain tensioner guide. This is where the chain tensioner goes up against. There's a single screw from the other side. If you do want to remove it, it could stay in place, but it is plastic, so if you bang that, it could damage it. The Primaveras and Sprints, they have a very good design head studs. Not really necessary to replace them. The GTSs, if you watch that video, I usually always replace them. Even if they are the updated design, they do stretch on those, especially if they're earlier head studs. But that's pretty much everything you need to know to split the cases and remove the crankshaft or the starter clutch, the flywheel. Pretty simple motors, built real similar to how a GTS is, but they're air-cooled. So the next one, I have all these parts clean, and we're gonna go ahead and reassemble the motor, the bottom end and the top end, in one whole video. So I'll have all my new parts ready to go. I'll show you some of the measurements I may make when assembling it, but they're pretty straightforward motors. The reassemble, pretty important to get the correct categorized crank replacement for the cases. So category 1 for this one right here. Category 2 in some cases. See you on the next one. There's a robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. So if you're looking for any of the specialized tools needed to tear down this motor, just go to the Scooter West web store. I think we even have an organized section of tools, and I specifically refer to the specialized tools for this engine as a 3V or the 3-valve, because it's the 125, 150 motor with the 3-valve, and it's a unique set of tools to assemble and disassemble the engine. I'll see you in the next one. Robot here.